thank you very much for the honor to be here. It's the second time that I'm in Palermo, and I have met lots of interesting people, and I would like to challenge you a little bit, or make a recommendation. I hope that you take some of it. My starting proposition is probably something you already don't like, namely, and it has to do with language. We talk too much about complex systems, as if the complexity has something to do with the systems. So I read, for example, the science of the 20th century is steadily losing certainty. How come? Or, what is standing in the way is complexity, as if this is a causal phenomenon for the kind of knowledge that we wish to have. And I think complexity is always associated, or we speak as if it were associated with large systems, with many actors, with big systems, numerous variables. And I don't doubt this. I have no reason for doubt this, but I think this is based on a fundamental illusion, and the illusion that we could understand the world by observing it. And I will show you why that isn't working. So instead I'm suggesting that complexity is first of all a word. Complexity is not there. Complexity is a word that we use in conversations with each other when we have difficulties coping with something. That's different from saying it's an attribute of the system. So I think that complexity is not the attribute of a system, rather our inability to cope with something. And when we think about this, then we see also that complexity changes over time as we acquire new models, new technologies, new methods, and that is a different kind of attitude. So I would like to today just to explore the epistemology of observation. What does it mean to observe? And then I show where it fails, or what are the limits of observation, and then talk about two neglected areas of knowing, design and use, and then finally come to the issue of language. How language in fact plays a role in what we start to know, or what we know. So now I think observation is always the assumption that observers could account for the causes of observation, as if observers could step out of their own body, see what's outside there, and say, I'm observing that. You never do. You just observe. And what you observe is actually what you get. Actually, I should probably not deviate too much, but I had actually a month ago a cataract operation. And then, I wouldn't say for the first time, but after the cataract operation, I saw the world very differently. Before that, I didn't see any blue, or not much blue. The world was blue. Everyone was smaller, or everything was smaller. And I had no clue what the reality really is, because all I'm doing is observing. And so what we should talk about our observing rather than what is observed. So now, what is the limit of the assumption that we could observe things as they are? Well, for example, let me start with what is called a trivial system. A trivial system is one that has numerous inputs and let's say one output, binary or yes-no type of thing. For example, this is a trivial system. It has an input, an output, it's a system, you observe it, you can describe it as a function, the input, output as a function of the input. It's a trivial system. Now, I think maybe you might be saying, well, we are interested in complex systems or trivial ones. But they can also become complex. So I'm asking myself, where do these trivial systems occur? And I would say they occur in so numerous explanations that we go automatically into. For example, whenever we talk about causes and laws of nature and effects, it's a trivial system. Or when we talk about stimuli and organisms and reactions, it's a trivial system. Or in logic, the premise, the logic, and the conclusion is a trivial system. Or in semiotics, the sign and interpretant and signification is a trivial system. Or in social research, sociology, independent variables, a function, and dependent variables is a trivial system. Or in communication channels, information sent channel, information received is a trivial system. And then last but not least, observing an object is also a trivial system, as if there's an object that causes me to make a description. So I think this is you see that this is pretty general as a phenomenon in much of sciences, natural sciences. And I think you probably will say right away, well, we deal with complex systems, but I think the argument or the description of what you observe often gets into this kind of very trivial notion. So I think if you look at the quantities, and now I'm going at the issue of complexity, if there is a certain number of inputs, you have actually the 2 to the power of the number of inputs as possible functions. So in order to understand the trivial system, you have to have so many observations. And if we assume that we, for example, that let's say a computer, 50 years of computing with 1 gigahertz computer gives us about 10 to the power of 18 number of things we can count. That's a limit. And we can of course think about 100 years, or we can about 1,000 years, but this is ridiculous. So 50 years of computing gives us no more than 10 to the power of 18 steps. So the number of trivial systems that we can observe and describe is about 10 to the power of 18. This is very minimal. Actually, it's a big number, no doubt. But beyond that, we cannot do very much else. We are limited. And that's where complexity starts. However, I mean, we rarely ever have that many inputs. So I think there is another worse limit, namely this is what Karl suggested, which is true, that nature never, or very ever, goes through all possible alternatives. I mean, if we have a system, a trivial system with 2 to the power of 18 inputs, it would be nice to see all of them, one after the other, and then in the end, we know what the system is like. But there's lots of repetition. So we never get to the power of 10 to the power of 18. And so he said, correctly, that theories can never be proven. You can only corroborate them with the observations that you have. So the limit is far, far small. And when we talk about complex systems, then we have to think of that this is a limit for trivial systems. But now let me think of a non-trivial system. And I'm doing actually, I'm repeating now something, an argument that Hans von Frostad, or Ross Ashby developed a system, built a system, a so-called ultra-stable system. And an ultra-stable system had a lot of internal inputs. And they had an effect on the output, and let me give you just a diagram. If you read that, there is an input and output, just like in a trivial system, but there are internal states, and they change the nature of the function, of the internal, of the output relationship. And so when you ask yourself, what can we observe them, or what is it, how far we can go to observe them, then you come to a very interesting type of calculation. If you have just one binary input, yes, no, there are 4 internal states, so 256 driving functions, and 6,500 state functions, that is doable. But as soon as you have 2 binary inputs, then you come to the 6 to the power of 1076 driving functions, and you can no longer acquire that by observation. So I think a non-trivial system of this very simple kind is not, you cannot observe it and understand by observation. So that is, I think, a fundamental limitation where, in fact, which is a justification for making a radical shift in the direction of a different kind of epistemology than observing complex systems. or the whole notion that complexity is outside is I think, untenable. So, what can one do? We live with complex systems, or systems that are more complex than we can describe. Well, one of them is that we can actually design systems that are very complex. We can design things, non-trivial systems, without problems. For example, computers, by all means, are very complex. They exceed our ability to observe, and yet we can make them. Or think of causal kind of models, or circular causal models, goal-seeking, self-organization, ultra-stable systems. And in fact, the very diagram that I presented a minute ago, this one, is a design. I designed that, or someone designed it. So I think when you think about, I'm going now in the wrong direction. So we can design things, but not observe them. Now, designing complex system is a very different activity from describing it. And I think we have to probably get out of the habit of believing that we could describe complex systems. We can design them. And actually, I've heard several presentations that didn't really describe things, but designed them, or designed a framework within which one can look at. And that is a different kind of epistemology to design things. Or think about complex mathematical models. We can construct them, we can simulate them, and that's a different kind of epistemology. So of all the artifacts that we can design, we know their histories, we know usually who designed this, we can usually put them in a particular context, start them in motion, and observe the consequences. And the amazing thing is, we heard also several people talking about the unanticipated consequences of technological development. And in most cases, the kind of systems that we can design, non-trivial systems, have consequences that we cannot anticipate, or have not anticipated. Very simple ones, that's no problem. But I think we have to learn that when we design something, we cannot fix the future. So, I mean, when I started out with kind of that general fear of uncertainty being increasing, we have to live with that, because it is a different kind of world. So now, I think when you think of limits of designing things, there are no easy quantitative limits. The limits are of a qualitative nature. For example, there is usually in all technological systems, there's a collaboration needed, and the collaboration among stakeholders is limiting actually that what you can design. Or there are technological constraints, maybe material things, ideas have to be materialized. Or that there are economic constraints, that means the kind of things, the non-trivial system that you design needs to be in some ways better or competing with what exists. And there are cultural constraints, namely, there needs to be have value for the community that interested in this kind of systems. So I think design is a very different kind of knowing than observing. And I think we have to learn that we can easily design complex systems, but observing is out of the question, unless they are very trivial. But there's another kind of phenomenon, namely use. It is amazing when you think of it. We can say we live in a complex world, but we use it, we live, we survive. And so that is a very different kind of knowing than in complexity. Without understanding the nature of that, what we use, we can handle things. So, for example, when you go to the internet, who knows really where is what? Who knows how it's constructed? Who knows? But we use it, and we are not threatened by it. We don't say, oh, it's too complex and we cannot do anything about it. We use it. And using is, again, a different kind of knowledge from designing it. It was designed, no doubt. And I know a few things about internet code, etc., but I have no clue really how that whole system works. Yet we can use it, all of us use it. And this is a different kind of knowledge that we have to cherish, and not thinking that we can describe things the way they are, or driving a car through the city. No? Like Palermo, it was amazing yesterday how I was driven through the city. And the complexity or the skill, let me say, the skill of the driver. Who is it? It was just amazing, you know. But I can tell you stories that she doesn't even know. But the point is, she could handle it. And it was it complex? Absolutely, for me.
Very complex.
Absolutely, but for her, it was a kind of a routine thing. Being at home here, it's not complex at all. Well, maybe it's some difficulties.
It's a bit complex, not so much.
Not so much. So, working in a social organization, whether you work in a university or in a company, there's a lot of things going on, but you're not really succumbed by the complexity. You have your desk, you do your things, and you contribute something, but this is a very different kind of knowing the organization in which you are. Or in fact, if you look at biology, living systems, all living systems from worms to monkeys to even human beings, they are not as complex as the world outside from our perspective, and yet they can survive. So I think there is a different strategy of knowing, which is mastering something, but not in terms of describing it, rather than using it. So I think from a point of view of users, the system's complexity, in the sense of being objectively there, remains fundamentally uninteresting. What is much more important is the ability to use it. So now, from a theory of the human use of non-trivial systems, needs to address the affordances. I mean, what kind of activities, what kind of cognitive structures, what kind of behaviors are afforded by the environment? The nature of the environment is secondary. In fact, we don't know it. Most of the time, we don't know. But we know what we can do. And the theory of this kind of complexity ought to be mapped into what we can do. So I think from the point of view you use, and I want to give you 3 examples that one obvious, one perhaps natural, and the other one which nobody recognizes. The obvious one is a computer interface. Now the computer interface is actually designed so that the user isn't bothered by the complexity of the inside. And in fact, any user of a computer, unless you are really a computer architect, I don't think any one of you knows really what's going on there. But this is not a big problem for you. You can use it. And what is in fact has made the computer nowadays so successful is the invention of an interface. That what interfaces between you and the operation of the machine, and that is a cultural phenomenon. We have icons, like for example the trash can in which we move a file. But when we do this, we think that we have trashed our file that we don't need anymore. And this is wrong. In fact, the file is still there. It's only put in a different register. So I think whatever that we see and however we work on a computer is designed to make an interface, make it usable. And the complexity behind is something that someone designs, no doubt, but it's not for us to really know. Now the other one is evolution by natural selection. I think evolution by natural selection is precisely to provide organisms that are such that they are afforded by the environment. It doesn't matter what the environment is. The organisms don't need to describe the environment. They need to simply survive. That means their habits of behavior, their reproduction need to be afforded by the world outside. And there comes one example that you probably maybe not quite so obvious. Scientific experiments. Now, I think scientific experiments are usually aimed at finding out what one experiments with. But this is not true. An experimenter sets up an experiment, decides what to observe, decides what kind of stimulus to manipulate, and all of these kind of things are actually activities of the experimenter. It doesn't produce anything about what the world is like. It produces actually only the theories by means of which the experimenter started to make the experiment, and the world outside affords these kind of theory. So in a very real sense, we can never really by experiments study what is outside there. We study our own conceptions, our own behaviors, and how that is supported by the world outside there. Now that is perhaps not, when we think about it, it's not really so unusual. Heisenberg at some point said, we observe not nature, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And that is what he says, what I mean to say. We cannot study nature. Nature is just there, but we ask questions and we get answers to our questions, not to the questions that the nature asks that we don't know. This is a different kind of knowing. And that is actually consistent with what I'm saying, use. We use the world to test our own conceptions, and we test whether they are afforded. Okay, now this is the kind of two different ways of looking at alternatives to observations which are so limiting. And then I want to talk about language. And I was actually amazed, well, actually not so amazed, because I expected that. When people talked here about complex systems, I've never heard anyone speaking, for example, about the Italian language that makes you able to speak about complex systems. And as I said in the beginning, we talk easily about this is a complex system, but this is a grammatical sentence which attributes a certain quality to some object. We don't talk about our language. I think this is a major mistake. And I think we have to learn that everything we say is said in language, and we speak in language about the phenomena, and the phenomena we know of are all through language. And it's not just so that you learn, for example, for politics in Italy or the United States through the media. That, of course, is obvious. But even what we know of each other, what happened here in this conference, is all transmitted through language. So language is the key to understand what we understand. So now, and I have to say, my conception of language differs from the traditional conception of language that I've developed so far. I mean, from the point of view of observation, language is actually a system of representation. And that is the classical way of thinking about language as an autonomous system of symbols, and they represent the observations that we have. Well, I said, this is not maintainable, and in fact, I think this is a form of language which doesn't really help us to understand our own situation, our own involvement in the world. So I think this system of representation that needs to be abundant. And the second one is more interesting. The discourse among designers is innovative. It's not representative. We talk about visions, and there was a paper on visions and so on. That was, I think, interesting because it's talk about something that doesn't exist, but it exists within the mind of people that can act, that can bring out certain kinds of phenomena. That is a different kind of language than just representing. And then finally is the issue of use. And I think there the kind of criteria of truth is not a representational truth, it's not a synthetic truth in the sense of design, it is actually the truth, an instrumental truth, to bring about something that one wants to bring about. So these are three different kinds of notions of language. But I'm not interested in either of them. I think for me, language is dialogical, it's inherently social, it's interactive, and it's kind of the, well, I say always the original artifact of humankind. I mean, this is the most important invention that I think human beings have done is to invent languaging or the process of interacting with each other. So, but that means a lot of things. For example, that language is not monologue. In a sense, what I'm actually doing right now is monologue. I'm just talking at you, so to speak. And I hope that this will change when you ask questions. But fundamentally, language is interactive. There's always someone that I address to in the expectations that I'm getting a response. So language has nothing to do with syntax. It has something to do with what you say and what you get in return. And this is a way we organize each other, with each other. For example, calling the meeting to order, or something like this. Language organizes us, or coordinates us. I think it coordinates also our perception. And when we talk about complex systems, we seem to know, or we seem to claim to know what that means, but we coordinate us by talking about complex systems, and then we say, okay, yeah, well, now we know. But how do you know? We coordinate our understanding by using language in that coordinated way. And I think what is fundamental is what I would call the sharing of narratives. What we have in common is not we don't share a conception. I have no clue what you conceive of what I'm saying, or vice versa, but what you hear is probably what I'm saying. So the narrative is that what we share. So I think language to me is dialogical, is interactive. It's not just making statements about the world. So I think narratives make our experiences meaningful. And I will give you one example. And that offers explanations where uncertainty prevails. And in fact, when we talk about earlier the loss of uncertainty, well, the uncertainty can be reduced by making a narrative, explaining something that was not explained before. And narratives do precisely that, or theories, right? And express values and desires and goals, it's all in language. And compel narratives, compel people to act. I mean, that is a part of language. And there's a whole area called speech act theory, in which the language is seen as action. Well, that goes back, for example, to Wittgenstein. That language is doing things, and etc. And then an important part of language is that we explore, affirm, criticize, deny, etc., etc. That's part of language or narratives. So now I just wanted to give you one example, and actually Gandolfo sent this around, and I copied it from Ilya Prigogine, a quote. I don't know if you read it. I found it very interesting, and that was a conversation that Heisenberg reported when he took a walk with Niels Bohr in 1931 or so. No, it wasn't after the war, wasn't it? No, it was during the war, 1941 or something. He went to Denmark, and the two physicists, the junior and the senior physicist, they took a walk, and Heisenberg recalled that, and I read it. Isn't it strange how this castle, meaning the Kronborg castle in Denmark, how this castle changes as soon as one imagines that Hamlet lived here? As a scientist, we believe that the castle consists only of stones and admire the way the architect put them together. The stones, the green roof, its patina, the wood carvings, the church constitute the whole castle. None of this should suddenly be changed by the fact that Hamlet lived here. Yet it changed completely. The walls and the ramparts speak a different language. Yet we all really know about Hamlet is that his name appears in the 13th century chronicle. But everyone knows the question Shakespeare had asked him, the human depth that was made revealed, and so he too had to be found a place here at Kronborg. Now this is a physicist speaking, saying this castle has changed by the very act of the kind of narrative that we had. And I think we have to learn that language changes our perception in the direction of the narratives that we accept. So I think, to me, language is not describing things, it constitutes things. Constitutes things that the act of speaking makes something true. And so I think all theories narrate something. And all scientific theories, they are discussed, published, and may read larger audiences, just like the story that Heisenberg made. Theories cannot help but affect the practices of people that have a stake in them. So I think if you think of language as constituting things, then we come to a very different kind of knowing. And I think when you think of a social theory, and that's something I'm interested in, but it is not limited to that. When it's a social theory, is published, is narrated, is accessible to those who are described in them, there are three different kinds of responses. The one is when the people are described in these terms, find themselves actually favorably described, they become more like the narratives that describes them. So a theory about others that are acceptable to those that are described therein becomes more valid. The opposite kind is that if you describe a theory of people that are opposed to how they are described, they will change their behavior and say, this is not us. And they will change their behavior to become different. We have, for example, in the United States, I mean, the whole notion of slavery and black narratives, etc., etc. There was at some point when many black people said, this is not us, we are not slaves, we are not inferior, black is beautiful. And they opposed the general narrative by their own. And that made, in fact, invalidated, if you want, the theory of blacks being inferior. So I think that the social theory has at least these two kinds of responses. Either it becomes more valid as it is accepted, or it becomes invalid when it's opposed. And then there's a third kind, of course, when it's irrelevant. Now, irrelevant, it can be irrelevant because it deals with something that one is not interested in. It can be irrelevant because one cannot do anything about it. When it describes, for example, genetic phenomena and we cannot change our genes so easily, then there is no point. And I think much of sociology is actually, has developed a methodology where people don't recognize themselves in it. And as such, it has become socially irrelevant. That means it's not changing its validity. But as soon as you can recognize yourself in it, it has the effect of either becoming more valid or less valid. So I think this is the nature of language as constituting itself in what we see and act. So I think there's an analogy of feedback, like there's positive feedback and negative feedback, and the positive feedback converges towards a stable point, to a state of homeostasis, and in some sense that is when theories become increasingly true, and the negative feedback is when the amplification increases and when it's a runaway, and that is when the theories become invalid in the course of being proposed. So now, graphically, what we have here is this. We have social practices. We can say we observe them, or I would say we construct them in some form. And then when we have the theory about the social system and feed it back into the social system or social practices, that is a feedback loop. And this is where reflexivity starts. And there are, in fact, two kinds of feedback loops. One is that the practices that are ongoing, and the other one is the effect of theory on the social practices. So these are two reflexive loops. The one is the process itself, and the other one is the effect of the theory on the process. So I think, to my surprise, actually not so surprising, but I think what I hope that I convince you at least of one thing, namely that the language that you're using has a lot of things to do with what you see. And there was one paper I don't remember who it was, but I was taking notes and said, when they said, this is the system. When I said, this is a system, this is not a system. This is a language describing systems, and they confused the theory with what's described. It became a system by the very act of describing it as a system. And in fact, before Bertalanffy, we didn't describe things as systems. Does it mean that the world didn't exist? No. We use the language to describe something, to make it useful for us to observe things in a different way. So I think natural sciences are in some ways prohibited, I hate to say, prohibited to become aware of the old language they're speaking. Physicists do not know, well, I would say, do not know that they, I want to say, do not know that they speak a language. They know, of course, that they speak a language. But the language spoken has no impact on the theories of physics. Physics does without language. And I think almost all natural sciences do not acknowledge the fact that by the act of speaking creates the kind of phenomena that they are describing. Biology, for example. So I think sociology has actually recognized this phenomena that I just described, but it describes it often in terms of biases or subjective phenomena, etc., etc. And I just made a certain list of what happens in sociology about this phenomena of theories becoming true. And this is the self-fulfilling prophecies. There is a guy named Thompson in 1928 who said, if men define a situation as real, they are real in their consequences. There is Robert Merton who described the self-fulfilling prophecies. But he always said the self-fulfilling prophecy is one where an initially untrue proposition becomes increasingly true by acting on the untrue proposition. And I don't want to get into the truth or untruth issue. The point is that actually by saying so, it becomes more valid or more invalid. But it has a tremendous effect. Or Herbert Simon, he developed actually a mathematics to get at predictions that have an effect of changing the nature of the voting in this case. And so Paul Watzlawick, and I saw that Gandolfo reproduced a paper of his, and he said also that the act of following self-fulfilling prophecies make it real. And much of psychoanalysis is actually a way of introducing a language that enables people to cope better than they have done before. So I think, again, the natural scientists are not incorporating their own language in their own theories. And I would hope that you do that. Examples of reflexivity is the so-called Oedipus effect. Popper studied this at length. Or in 1929, the economic crisis, there was a publication that the banks have no money to pay back the savings. So if everyone believes that, and you go to the bank, indeed they cannot pay all the savings because they invest. They're invested. And so you create precisely the catastrophe that was predicted. Or in 1979, the gasoline crisis. There was in the United States, actually in California, well known, there was a journal, a newspaper published saying there is not enough gasoline around, and the Arabs have turned against the United States, and there was no gasoline coming. And soon everyone put gasoline in their tanks, and there was not enough gasoline around. I remember in Philadelphia, there were cars going around 2 blocks waiting for the gasoline to get gasoline full. This is the case when a theory becomes known and people act on it and make it real. Or then there is, for example, a guy named Rosenberg who made experiments in education, and there were 2 classrooms. They had the same composition of students. One teacher was told to have a good classroom, brilliant people, the other one not. And so they were teaching the best they could. And lo and behold, in the end, when they were tested objectively, those who had been shown to be or said to be better, they tested better. And these are because actions change the nature of the reality that the theory produces. So right now we have, of course, also the economic crisis. Actually, I was just there was this one paper, I think you, yeah. I mean, what do you know about the economic crisis? You know it only through the newspapers. Maybe you have a friend who lost a job, but this is not an economic crisis by your experience. But you know it, and you act on it. A lot of people act on it, and it becomes an economic crisis. So in a very important sense is that what you hear about the world is affecting your actions, and it makes it real. Now I have to also say it doesn't work always. For example, I noticed there is, surprisingly I guess, rain in here, and you see suddenly so many vendors selling umbrellas.
Yeah.
That changes, of course, not the rain, but when there are actions that have an effect on the kind of phenomena that you're describing, then you change the reality in the direction or against the theory that you start out with. And there are numerous examples, and I took that one. The point is now comes, how do we understand that? And I think fundamental to that is that we have to see there are inside and outside. And I heard actually several times in the presentation, when you're inside, things look different from the outside. When you're inside a reflexive loop, then you understand things differently from the outside. From the outside, you have actually not much clue of what's going on inside, mainly because insiders describe the world in terms of their own actions, what they can do, and from the outside, that is not accessible. So the experiences from insider are necessarily different. So I think this is what we have to understand, that the position of the one who wants to understand complex systems is radically different from when you are an actor inside or try to be an observer from the outside. So from the inside there is little uncertainty because you act and that is very satisfying. That's, of course, you don't know everything, but it is not bothering you. From the outside, it seems to be chaotic, uncertain, etc., etc. So I think we have to realize that most familiar narratives of reflexivity, such as the ones that I mentioned in sociology, they start out with bias, with untrue statements, and in fact many of the examples of that the world ends in so many days, and so it turned out to be false. But this is, as I said, it's far more fundamental that certain kinds of theories that we live by come from narratives and are realized, made real by our action on it. I don't know if you know the theory of reflexivity of George Soros. He is dealing with this also from an individual point of view. And in fact, he talks about when you believe that certain kind of stocks will be going down, that has an effect on buying or selling. But this is individual, and I think we have to make I would like to make a claim to say this deals with much larger issues as well. So I think whenever language is involved, it creates beliefs and expectations, and the theories have to be seen always as narrated and creating precisely those kind of beliefs that stakeholders then act on. And I have to say also, it's not so that George Soros, for example, thinks that one can understand, let's say, the rational behavior or an irrational behavior if it's shared with everyone, then one can easily cope with this. But the theories compete. And we have, for example, in the United States right now, it's kind of, in my opinion, terrible situation between Republicans and Democrats, a fundamentally different kinds of theory of what government should be like. Democrats basically saying, we have to take care of the poor, and the rich should pay something, and the Republicans saying, we should give the rich more money so that they can pay the party, the Republican Party, and if someone isn't insured, it's their own problem, they can die, that doesn't matter. So there are fundamental differences in how government should run. So the theories are not so uniform, they compete with each other. So, but I think when we get back to the issue of this kind of diagram, we have to think of that this takes place in conversations. In conversations, these kind of phenomena have to be separated into conversations, not just a theory, but also what happens interactively. So when you think of conversations, that each responds to, according to the theory that he or she has about the other. That means we observe what happens between us, make our mind and act accordingly. And that is in both directions. So I think if each responds according to the theory that is going on in the other, then there is also the need of understanding the other's theory, one's own theory and other theories, and one's own actions are explained not just by the theory of the way the world is, but also the theory that the other person has relative to mine. So I think this is kind of the theory of reflexivity, and again, insiders are relatively sure of what's going on, and I think, you know, intuitively, if you are in a conversation, that's usually not frightening. It's very comfortable, in fact. You create new things that you have never thought of, and they're not bothersome, even though there's uncertainty, but this uncertainty is manageable, is desirable, is in fact pleasant. But from the outside, or as outside observers, you don't know what's going on inside a conversation. So I think reflexivity is unavoidably linked to the use of language. And it constitutes all social systems, I would say. So I think in a reflexive conversation, in any sort of conversation, what is common there is that memberships are acknowledged or denied. It means one addresses someone, and in addressing someone, you acknowledge the other person as a participant. In conversations, in interpersonal relationships, including who you really are, your own identities are negotiated, are established, are created and reaffirmed. And there are commitments are negotiated. I think that's very important, that commitments arise in conversations. And realities are declared, are talked about, and people agree to this is what it is, whether you talk about an economic crisis or whether you talk about a complex system. At some point there is, okay, I agree, this is what the problem is. And then there are also constraints on conversation are discussed within the conversation. This is another reflexive move that conversations do not go just in one direction. It can also be denied, can be affirmed, repaired, or destroyed, etc., etc. So these are all reflexive practices, and I think their conceptions always refer back to themselves. And I think, for example, the theory of conversation must account also for conversing about that theory. And I'm saying also when we talk about the communication theory, and my criticism with several colleagues of mine when they developed very abstract communication theories, they are not applying to the theorists. And I think that is a mistake, because then you put yourself in a kind of elitist or godlike position outside, and I think that needs to be changed. But to me, a social organization can be seen as a system of commitments. Like, for example, this social organization, now Evolution, is we are committed for a moment at least to sit here and listen to me, and maybe you're bored, but the point is you're committed to do certain kind of things. Or if you think of a large factory, you're committed to be in time, to do a certain kind of job, but this is all negotiated in conversations. So for me, conversations are an essential part of what a social organization exists or consists of. And managing social organizations means actually keeping the underlying reflexivity within the level of understanding, not make it too complex so that you cannot cope with it. So I think in conversations, or in these large conversations, there are always alternative theories that emerge, and these theories interact with each other. And so social systems becomes the theories that they communicate, that are communicators and act. And the kind of image that I wanted to see, there are many, many theories that that are held by different kinds of people, and they interact with each other. I think we have to realize that it's not such a, like in much of economics, there's a singular claim of a singular rationality. That isn't so. In politics, we know that there are lots of competing type of theories. So now I wanted to end with some sort of an invitation to change, and I want to summarize what I'm really arguing for. When you talk about complexity, I'm suggesting that you stop talking about complexity as a property of the system, rather than talk about the difficulties of coping. And that puts it back to the analyst or yourself. Right? When we talk about language, I think one should not talk about it as independent of my concern. I think we should be saying as constituting one's concern. When we talk about in language, we talk about certain things that occur in language, and that process of talking needs to be recognized as being our concern. When truth conditions, I mean, if you're interested in philosophy or logic, the representational truth notion needs to be replaced by sort of a constitutive notion of truth, where there's acknowledgement of acceptance, there's accountability, etc., etc. Theories should be moved away from being independent of that what is theorized to saying this is part of what is theorized. So I think when we talk about complex systems, that is what you should talk about, the complexity of describing a system as complex. So when we talk about systems, there's, I think, a general tendency in general systems to say the system is everything that's connected. And since everything is connected, we become bigger and bigger, and then at the end you say, oh, we have to deal with the whole thing. Well, then we cannot deal with the whole thing. I think we have to see that a system is the language part of a concern. That means that's what we describe, what we have a language for. And so I think we have to understand that language is that what brings a system forward to us to cope. Or the researcher, I think from an outside observer, we have to realize that they are always inside. An observer is always an outsider, and when you want to deal with a complex system, whether it's a conversation, a social organization, or a big economy, the best person who knows is the insider. This is, for example, what George Soros claims. He is a very successful manager, and he proved his theories by becoming rich. And the interesting part, think about it, why our economists are not rich, you know? Because they always stay outside and they don't act. And that is very difficult. This is a different kind of knowing, is to trade, to act. And that is, I think, this, if you want to understand a complex system, you have to become part of it. You have to become insider. And then the issue is the activity of research should not be observing and analysis, but contributing to the reality construction. Now, when you design a viable system, that is a design from the outside, and maybe that makes a contribution to a particular type of organization, but this is a different kind of notion than the claim that the system is a viable system. It's not. The viable system occurs in language and it can be used by people and makes a contribution. So, and I think in terms of determinability, I mean, when many people say, well, uncertainty, risk, and so on, or incomplete information, this is threatening economic theory. This is true. It threatens economic theory if from the outside, if taken from the outside, describing the system as being independent of the description. But it is not so. When you are inside, then it becomes an issue of communicative clarity. It is everything but uncertain. So, and I would say, there is an epistemological shift towards reflexivity, and all I wanted to think about, and maybe some people will question but others perhaps hopefully will adopt the idea that the language that you use has a tremendous amount of effect of that, what you describe, what you see. In fact, you can only, I would say, you can only see what you have language for. And so I think we need to take language very seriously and become reflexive in our constructions of reality. Thank you.